Hello students, it's Mrs. Schrawn here, and we are giving this whole virtual classroom thing a try, hoping to still keep you guys on track with getting your units for your English for the year, and just to keep us engaged in learning so we can finish out the year strong in spite of all of the craziness going on in the world. Sorry, as I'm trying to figure this out. I hope you're all doing well and that you're enjoying maybe some time of rest and some sleeping in and maybe some fun family activities that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. I have a few things for us today. First, just a little review of the format that we'll be doing. We're going to continue on working through the year, the syllabus as it was planned. That will today include some grammar work. We're going to continue it on learning about our comma rules, and then we will do some reflection time on A Clean, Well-Lighted Place and talk about Ernest Hemingway a little bit more. And then we will be reviewing our thinking out loud and close reading skills that we have so that we can continue to remember how to analyze written work and poetry. And then we will be talking about Walt Whitman, which will then springboard us into talking about the Harlem Renaissance period. And you're probably like, what? First of all, if you know who Walt Whitman is, and then the Harlem Renaissance movement, if you know what that is, you're probably wondering how the heck I'm going to weave that together. But I've done it a few times. So thank you for your patience. We'll be doing this video lesson, which will probably be somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. And then on Wednesday, and I'll be posting this probably Tuesday morning. On Wednesday, we will do a live Zoom to just touch base, to talk about any thoughts or feedback that you guys have and want to share about A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. And then we can go from there. All the instructions will continue to be on Edmodo. I am super available. You can email, text, call, message, Zoom with me. Just always make sure it's with parents' permission and that you have a parent included on any email or text threads that we use. With the exception, of course, being Edmodo, you're allowed to just direct message me on Edmodo because your parents should have an account where they can oversee everything. All right, so comma rules, okay? We did 1 through 4, and you're tracking those and you're making your grammar page for your notebooks. You will be adding rules 5, 6, 7, and 8 to that this week, okay? So rule 5 is that we use a comma with introductory adverb openers that are dependent clauses. They are dependent clauses, and they have to be followed by a comma, okay? So a dependent clause, just to review what that means, a dependent clause is a group of related words that has a subject and a verb, but it can't stand alone on its own as a sentence. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. So we use introductory adverb openers have to have a comma. An example of that is, as she couldn't reach the juice herself, comma, she had to ask for help. Okay, and so you're probably asking like, well, what's an adverb? Well, an adverb is a word that modifies a verb or adds to a verb. And some of the most common ones are, we can memorize this www.asia.be. Okay, www.asia.be. And so these are the most common ones that you're going to see and use in writing. While, when, where, as, since, if, although, and because. Okay, so if you see those words or if you use those words, that should be a dead giveaway that you need to use a comma following that clause. So, and I said that adverb clauses are dependent clauses. So can you just say, as she couldn't reach the juice herself, period? No, you can't, because you have to answer that as she couldn't, right? So she had to ask for help. So adverb openers, www.asia.be, and need a comma. And then rule number 6, you need to use a comma after introductory ing phrases, okay? Even if they're short. So I know one of our rules from last meeting was with prepositional openers, you only have to use a comma if it's 5 or more words. With ing phrases, you have to use it regardless, okay? So an example of that would be driving to the store in the rain, comma, he encountered a terrible accident. Because driving to the store in the rain can't stand alone as a sentence, right? So that needs a comma, and it's an ing opener, so it needs a comma. The next one, number 7, is we use commas after with verbs of speaking that are introducing a direct quote. So verb of speaking tells us who's talking, and that usually comes before or after a quote, right? So when we're introducing a quote, for example, the young boy protested, comma, but I don't want to go to bed. So this is our verb of speaking, protested, right? So that's telling us that somebody's vocalizing something. It's a verb of speaking. Gets a comma, and then you start your quote, and then because it's a direct quote, we've talked about this with our quote rules too, it gets another capital because it's the beginning of the sentence that somebody is saying, okay? So the young boy protested, comma, but I don't want to go to bed, exclamation point, and quote. All right, and then the last one is we use a comma to separate NDAs, which is a noun of direct address, okay? A noun of direct address is when we are talking to somebody, we use their name or their formal title, okay? So an example of that would be, can you please push in your chair, Julie? When I'm speaking directly to Julie, and I had to pick a name that I don't have any students because I didn't want anyone to think I was picking on them. Can you please push in your chair, comma, Julie? So anytime you're directly addressing somebody and it's using a noun, person, place, or thing, and it's speaking directly to somebody, you're going to set that off or separate it with a comma, okay? Another example might be, how's your day been, doctor? So if you're speaking to someone who has the title of doctor, you're still going to set that off as a noun of direct address. You're not speaking to any doctor anywhere. You're speaking to a specific person who's a doctor, so that gets a comma. So can you please push in your chair, comma, Julie? How has your day been, comma, doctor? All right? So those are rules 5, 6, 7, and 8. You're going to add those to the list that you're compiling of comma rules. There are quite a few, so we'll finish those up next week. So by now you should have 8 comma rules and be working on that sheet that will go in your grammar resource notebook. All right, so now let's do a little bit of discussion about Ernest Hemingway. As you guys probably remember, he happens to be one of my favorite authors. I'm not quite sure exactly why. I think I am just intrigued by his life and his experiences and how those shaped his style. And I've read a few of his works, and I also really love Western Europe, and so most of his stories take place in Western Europe, so I'm drawn to them for that reason. One of my favorite of his books I actually read while I was traveling through Western Europe, and I would read it on the train as we would travel between cities, and I do that often. I don't know if I've told you guys that, but when I'm visiting a region, I try to bring books that are set in that region, and so anytime I think of the stories, I think of my travels, and then when I think of my travels, I think of the stories. And so I know that's probably really dorky, but you have to remember that if I had to use one word to describe me, it would probably be romantic. I embody everything of that romantic movement in literature, and I'm just drawn to beautiful things and to deep feeling, and so that probably makes sense why I would enjoy teaching something like literature so much. But it's kind of a stark contrast to Hemingway because he had an interesting way of weaving romance through his works, but in such a simple way, which to me is just so genius. And I think that's why there's a lot of research and commentary and biography written about Ernest Hemingway. It was also a bit unique that he really did achieve fame in his lifetime. So again, when we talk about a lot of the artists of previous generations, a lot of them, unless they were sponsored by a king or queen or a wealthy family, did not achieve fame in their lifetime. Whereas he did, and I think it kind of haunted him as we've seen kind of unfold. I think social media has really helped us to see how fame really affects the human psyche. So anyways, back to Hemingway. So a clean, well-lighted place. It's a basic story. We'll call it a story. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's a basic story about three men and a short period of time one evening in a cafe / bar, okay? And so we have the older waiter, we have the younger waiter, and then we have the old man, okay? On the surface, it seems like a very, very simple story. If you noticed, Hemingway doesn't add a lot of detail into his story. It's very cut and dry. It's very curt. And that is on purpose, okay? So he didn't want to give you any information that would influence your ability to connect with the story and make your own decisions about what was going on. This was a very new thing in art and literature, okay? So this is one of the things that defines the modernist movement. They're not trying to get you to think something on purpose. They're letting you use your own thoughts and ideas to come to a conclusion about what you're reading. Think about the fact that these people had grown up raised by parents who were of the Victorian era, okay, and some of their childhood was in the Victorian era where there was such a hard and fast way for everything to be. In Europe, there was a social structure, there were norms, there were cultural things that were acceptable and not acceptable. And so doesn't it make sense then that the modernists would move towards something so nonsensical or abstract or things that people would want to reason through on their own? Remember, Hemingway was part of the lost generation. So this is the post-World War I generation of people that felt lost. They've been taught all of these things, all of these constructs of culture and society, and they had just been so deeply affected in such a grand way by war. Think about how awful it is being a teenager, right? It's confusing. You're a kid, but you're almost an adult. You're expected to do all these big things, and then you get sent off to war, and you see the horrors of post-industrialized war happening. And then you're trying to make sense of the fact that this is a good world when you have just seen some of the most horrible imagery in human history. Nothing like World War I had ever happened before, okay? Previous to World War I, battles were fought like it was gentlemen's warfare. The redcoats, since it was mostly Britain, would line up and there was a certain way you did war. Now in this post-industrialized world, we have these huge cannons and we have machine guns and we have chemical warfare happening. Most of us don't study World War I enough. I am a huge believer that you need to study World War I to understand the modern world, to understand why things went from such a structured Victorian classical model to the world that we have today, and why humanism and things were embraced at such a deep level. So these artists, so Hemingway was part of the lost generation. I told you guys he was an expatriate. He moved from the United States to Europe, lived in Paris, was gallivanting around Paris, not always being the best person, with names like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein, and they were working together and kind of building this new movement. One of the things that you'll notice about Hemingway is he uses very little adjectives, okay? And that's something that scholars talk about a lot. So again, that is to really help you to be freed up to make your own decisions about things, okay? And then this story is not considered really a story. It's really a character sketch. The story doesn't have or follow the traditional plot line that we've studied as a class, right? There's not, like a beginning, a rise in action, a climax, and then a denouement or a falling action. It's kind of just a couple people having conversations, one change of scenery, and then it's done. So we actually classify this not really as a short story, but more as a character sketch, okay? So again, we talked about the fact that it's part of the modernist movement. Some other names that you would notice from the modernist movement would again be Gertrude Stein, Virginia Woolf. James Joyce is considered the father of the modernist movement. Now, one of the things about James Joyce, I've tried to read him before, and it's really difficult. His most famous work is called Ulysses, and I tried to read that when I was in Ireland a couple of years ago, and I couldn't do it. It was too difficult. And one of the reasons why it's too difficult is because it's modernist, which means that it follows this very different structure. It's more of a stream of consciousness. It's kind of meant to be confusing and not follow the rules. But he weaves in all of these classical pieces and references that you have to know to understand the story. And I do not have a good training in things like Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Inferno. I have not taken the time yet to study those things. But we see a reflection of this modernist stream of consciousness type feeling written into the story when we get into the place where he starts talking about the Lord's Prayer, and it's all nada, nada, nada. Nada this, nada that. That may have kind of thrown you for a loop and been a little bit confusing. I'm sure you all picked up on the fact that it was part of the Lord's Prayer because we're all believers and most of us have to memorize that when we're little, right? But if you didn't, it was a reference to the Lord's Prayer. And this part of the story is really a great example of some of the attitudes and feelings of this lost generation. They're really questioning religion. They're really questioning God. And again, it's the humanist movement kind of taking a hold again in this generation, okay? So let's talk about the three characters. We have the young waiter, we have the older waiter, and we have the old man, okay? So let's see here. So these three characters are very different and they display very different attitudes about life, right? We have the young waiter who is young, he's married, and he just wants to get home to his wife. He wants to enjoy her company, right? And then you have the older waiter who's kind of making fun of him and pressing on him in a very pessimistic attitude, right? He tells the young waiter that he's got everything because he's young, he's married, and he's employed. Like, that's all that you need to make you happy. We never hear about if the old man has any sort of joy in his life. He doesn't talk about going home to anybody. He doesn't care if he works late into the night because that's really all he has to do anyways, right? And then you have the older man who we get to find out had just recently tried to commit suicide, and his niece saved him, right? So anyways, these three characters, most scholars believe, are reflective of Hemingway and his attitude at different periods in his life. So when he was young, he was in love at one time. If you guys went back and read some biographies about him, he fell in love with a British nurse when he was working as a Red Cross ambulance driver in Italy during World War I. She broke his heart. I think we talked about this a little bit, but it ruined him for the rest of his life. He was quoted as saying that he would always leave a woman first because he never wanted to be left again. So we see that reflected in the conversations between the older man and the younger man. And then the waiters, and then the old man is just like a hopeless ending to life. Now, again, this is really reflective of the attitudes and ideas that were prevalent during this lost generation, and part of the philosophy that was being embraced at that time, okay? But this story, the setting for this story is a cafe, right? A clean, well-lighted cafe, and then we have the bar, or bodega, I think it's called, that the older waiter decides to visit when they shut the cafe down a little early, and he doesn't last very long there. And so we also believe that this takes place in Spain because of some of the Spanish words that are used, and because Hemingway spent a lot of time in Spain. He really enjoyed being in Spain. I've not been to Spain yet, but because I love Hemingway, I want to go to Spain. All right, so that's the setting. The tone in this is very dark and pessimistic, right? So there's a lot of contrast being used, and we're going to talk about all the things that are contrasted in this story, and a lot of harshness being expressed toward conventional things in life, okay? Like religion and relationships. There's a lot of symbolism in this story too, and that's where we see this these contrasting ideas coming out. So we have the contrast of these three stages of life: young, older, and even older. And then we have the contrast of youth and hope with old and pessimistic, right? And then we have the contrast of noisy and quiet, right? We have dark and light. At the beginning of the story, it talks about the leaves, the light casting a shadow of the leaves on the wall. And then later we hear about the contrast of the light on the coffee machine, which is also man-made versus nature, okay? And then we have the contrast of religion and atheism, or a-religion, non-religion. So the religious niece saves the old man, her uncle, right? Because she believes that if he commits suicide, it's a ticket to hell, right? That's what the Catholic Church in general believes, that suicide takes you to hell. So we have that contrast of religion in the youth and a religion in the older man, because no one wants to go to hell, hopefully. So I don't believe that the character would have killed himself if he knew that was what was going to happen, right? And then we have that idea expressed of non-religion with the nada, nada, nada prayer by the older waiter. All right, so that was a lot. That went a little bit longer than I thought it would have. So these are the main takeaways from this story, okay? We want to focus in on Hemingway's style. We want to understand that he was part of the lost generation. We want to reflect on his work and see that he uses little adjectives to help you make up your own idea about the story. We want to remember that this is a character sketch and not a real short story because it doesn't have a true plot line. That this is a good piece, a very short, good piece that we can analyze, that is part of the modernist movement, reflected especially in the stream of consciousness that we see happening in the nada, nada, nada prayer. We want to remember that the three characters are reflective of Ernest Hemingway in three periods of his life. And then we want to remember that contrasting imagery: light, dark, clean, dirty, old, young, nature, man-made, religious, non-religious. All right. All right, so now we're going to be talking about Walt Whitman, okay? Walt Whitman, we're not going to focus too much on him, but this is a transition that I like to do into the Harlem Renaissance because I really think it helps you to establish a foundation for why movements like the Harlem Renaissance are so important for us to study when we talk about American literature or just literary movements as a whole. Now, Harlem Renaissance is important to study because it is the first truly uniquely American literary movement in American literature's history, okay? So we'll talk about that a lot more next week. But I wanted to touch on Walt Whitman because he is such an influential part of American literature as well. He was born in 1819 in New York City, and he began working in a print shop, which helped him to really fall in love with the written word. He was largely self-taught, okay, but he was a voracious reader, which we see as a common thread in a lot of very powerful American voices. Some other self-taught people were like Benjamin Franklin was largely self-taught. Abraham Lincoln was largely self-taught. Again, Walt Whitman, self-taught. And they are three huge, powerful, influential Americans. They also, three of them share in common that they were voracious readers, okay? So the lack of his formal education actually helped to benefit his voice as a poet. He didn't maybe feel the pressure to adhere to the strict guidelines that European poets were still being held to in the 1800s, in the early 1800s. He worked as a teacher, and he was deeply, deeply moved at one point when he was working as a reporter at what he saw in New Orleans in the slave trade. He was working as a newspaper editor, and he had gone to New Orleans and was deeply affected by that. Now, another, again, American voice that was deeply affected by what he saw in the slave trade, again in New Orleans, was Abraham Lincoln, okay? So this really helped to shape him as a man. and as an artist, as a writer. So his most famous work that we have is called Leaves of Grass. It was published in 1855, and it's been republished and revised. It was republished and revised a couple times during his lifetime. And he, so one of the other things that was very influential in his life is he worked with soldiers during the Civil War. He was too old to fight in the Civil War, but he wanted to give back to his country in some way, which it also is very unique that we're talking about this day, because the same thing was true of Hemingway. He had an eyesight problem and he couldn't serve as a soldier, so he signed up to be an ambulance driver for the Red Cross because he wanted to get involved somehow. So same thing with Walt Whitman. He helped to care for soldiers, and he did this for 11 years. He was famous in his lifetime, but financially was kind of a mess. But even though he wasn't good with his finances, he did help support his mother. He had a brother that was an invalid, and so he cared for him too. And he was known as a very generous man. With these soldiers that he cared for, oftentimes he would bring them gifts and help to support them as well. Now, he worked for the Department of the Interior, which is a government agency, until he had a stroke and it paralyzed him in 1873. He died on March 26th of 1892, and he is considered one of the most important and influential American poets, along with Emily Dickinson, who I don't think we're going to have time to get to this year, but I highly recommend that you read some of Emily Dickinson's work and you look into her life. She had a very interesting life, as we're finding with a lot of artists, right? So now, Whitman is considered the first real American poet. And the work we're going to read today is called I Hear America Singing. And I'm going to read that to you guys. The file will be posted on Edmodo, so you can read along with me. Hopefully you have that printed out. It says, I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work, or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon, intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her, and to none else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths, their strong, melodious songs. Now, while this follows some sort of structure, it's very different from some of the works that we've looked at that have a predictable meter, a scansion, that have an end rhyme pattern. This is a very different form of poetry, and so you can start to see there's a transition happening. And remember, Walt Whitman was American. Some of the others that we've looked at, like Longfellow, was still being highly influenced by Europe. And same thing with not Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and then what's the other poet we looked at? Anyways, yeah, hopefully you see a difference in the style that's being used here, and that's again why Whitman is considered the first truly American poet. Okay, so read this poem, study it, look to Edmodo for what you need to do with it, and then we will pick back up with I Hear America Singing next week when we start to talk about Harlem Renaissance, specifically the poet Langston Hughes. So see you next week on the video, and see you soon on our Zoom, which will be at 11:30 on Wednesday, April 1st. It's no joke, guys. Come on, I had to put it in there. I had to.